The morning sunlight stretched across the sky as the school bus rolled along its usual route. Inside, everything felt normal, just the everyday hum of chatter and routine, until a sudden, blood-curdling scream cut through the air. A desperate voice crackled over the bus's intercom, panicked and unclear. Instantly, the easy mood evaporated, replaced by wide-eyed stares and hushed whispers. The driver, Henry, felt a knot of dread in his chest as he grabbed the radio and called for help. Pulling the bus over to the side of the road, he turned off the engine. The silence outside was eerie compared to the chaos unraveling moments before. Something was very wrong. Henry quickly ushered all the kids off the bus, lining them up along the roadside. The kids looked petrified. Some were crying, clinging to each other, their little faces twisted with fear. Henry tried to calm them down, though deep down he felt powerless. He'd already called the police, but until they arrived, all he could do was keep everyone as safe as possible and hope for the best. "Mr. Henry, are we going to be okay?" one of the kids asked, her voice shaking. Henry gave her the most reassuring smile he could muster. "Of course, sweetheart. The police are on their way, and everything's going to be fine. I promise I'll get you all home safely." But as much as he wanted to believe that, there was an uneasy doubt in the back of his mind. When the police finally pulled up, they moved quickly, rushing onto the bus to investigate. Whatever had happened, time was of the essence. Henry watched nervously from where he stood with the kids, trying to piece together what on earth had just unfolded. What exactly had he and the children heard over that intercom? Why did it feel like so much more than a false alarm? Just hours earlier, it had been a totally normal start to the day. The morning had been gorgeous, with sunlight warming up the town as Henry made his usual stops, picking up the kids for school. Mondays were always buzzing with energy, since everyone had weekends worth of stories to share. Henry greeted every kid by name, exchanging small smiles and waves with their parents. The bus was alive with chatter and laughter, even a little too much sometimes, but Henry didn't mind. He loved his job. "Morning, Ryan. Hey, Kate. Nice haircut, Jonah." Henry greeted the kids with a smile as they piled onto the bus. "Good morning, Mr. Henry," they all chimed back like they'd been doing for years. He'd been driving this route forever, and over time, he and the kids had gotten pretty familiar with one another. The bus was buzzing with energy as everyone caught up, their chatter filling the space. It felt like the perfect start of the week, good vibes all around, but no one had a clue how wild the day would turn out to be. By the time it was all over, even the cops would be dragged into the mess. They were just a few stops away from the school when everything flipped upside down. Out of nowhere, a blood-curdling scream tore through the bus. Henry's heart skipped a beat. For a second, he thought he must have imagined it. But then he glanced back and could see it written all over the kids' faces. They were just as freaked out as he was. And as the silence settled, the words from the scream hit him like a truck. Someone had shouted there was a bomb on the bus. And then came the kicker. Countdown initiated. "We have minutes to live." Henry's stomach dropped, but he knew he couldn't waste a second. This was as real as it gets, and he had to think fast. There was no room for mistakes. Henry didn't waste a moment. He hit the brakes and pulled the bus over to the side of the road. His mind raced, but his training kicked in. Training he'd hoped he'd never have to use. Years on the job, and now of all times, here he was. "Everybody off now," he shouted as he flung the bus doors open. He jumped out first, ready to help the kids get off as quickly as possible. Glancing around, he saw they were next to a big open field. Good. That would work. Head straight for the field and stay there. "Don't go anywhere near the bus, and keep your distance from it," he barked. Just as he was about to step back inside, he turned to face the group again, his voice tightening. "All right, does anyone want to tell me something? Now would be the time." Not a peep. Just blank stares and shifting feet. Seriously? Nobody? Was this someone's idea of a joke? He got nothing but silence in return. Great. Whatever was going on, these kids weren't about to give him answers. He spun on his heel and dashed back into the bus, grabbing his phone to call the cops. Quickly, he relayed what had happened and dropped a pin for their location. "Sir," came the serious voice on the other end of the line. "Get everyone off the bus and stay as far away as possible. Help is on the way." Henry didn't need to be told twice. He did a final walkthrough of the bus to make sure there wasn't a single kid left behind. Once satisfied it was empty, he climbed out and rejoined the jittery group of students standing in the field. "Mr. Henry," a tiny voice broke through the murmurs. A little girl tugged on his sleeve. "Is there really a bomb on our bus?" Henry's heart twisted. What could he even say? He crouched down, offering a small, reassuring smile. "Everything's going to be fine. The police are on their way, and we'll get you all to school soon. Don't worry." But that little pep talk didn't land as softly as he'd hoped. A chorus of panicked voices rose around him. Kids were crying, one shouting, "I want my mom," while another shrieked, "We're all gonna die." It was chaos. Henry did his best to comfort them, but his head was spinning. That scream, the sound that had sent a chill through the intercom just moments ago, it had been real. And where had it even come from? The intercom was only accessible from the driver's seat, and no one had been near him when it happened. None of it made sense. The more he tried to unravel it, the more tangled it all felt in his mind. He finally forced himself to stop thinking about it. His job now was clear: stay with the kids, keep them calm, and wait for the cops. That was all he could do. Still, as he watched the kids huddled together in the field, something gnawed at him. He could only hope help would get there before it was too late. He didn't even want to think about the nightmare this could turn into if things went south. Meanwhile, Officer Dillon and Officer Williams were rushing to the scene. They had called in the bomb squad too, and someone from the juvenile division had also tagged along, given the suspect was potentially a kid. They weren't sure if the threat was legit, but no one was willing to gamble on that. Fortunately, the bus wasn't far from the station, so they'd be there soon. In no time, they pulled up, jumped out of the car, and were met by Henry, who looked completely overwhelmed. "Thank you for getting here so quickly. This is awful. I don't know what to do," he blurted out, clearly panicked. "Don't worry, sir. We got it from here." One of the officers reassured him before turning their attention to the group of kids nearby, who looked extra spooked now that the cops had shown up. "Hey, it's going to be okay, all right? You'll all be back in your classrooms soon enough," they said, trying to calm the kids down. Another bus was already on its way to take them back to school. No point keeping them anywhere near the scene. Henry made it clear the current bus was empty, with all the students safely off. The officers decided to move fast. If this whole thing wasn't just a hoax, there was no time to waste. They told Henry to stay clear of the area and wait for the bomb squad, which would be arriving any minute now. Officer Dillon climbed onto the bus, his partner right behind him, and made his way to the driver's seat. He grabbed the intercom mic and gave it a test, speaking into it to see if it worked. The system seemed fine, nothing unusual there. Turning back toward the aisle, he glanced at his partner and said, "You check the right side. I'll handle the left." The kids had clearly scrambled off in a hurry, leaving jackets and backpacks scattered all over the seats. Dillon started with the first row, carefully unzipping a backpack to check inside. No boom. He zipped it back up and moved on to the next one. Across the aisle, Officer Williams was doing the same. They were halfway through their sweep, about 7 rows in, when they heard Henry call out from outside the bus, asking if they'd found anything. "Not yet," Dillon called back. He added firmly, "Stay where you are. We'll let you know if we find something. Just keep your distance." Henry, caught off guard by their sharp tone, stepped back without protest. As much as it stung, he understood they were just doing their job. He stood waiting, nerves rattled, while the officers pressed on with their search. Within minutes, the 2 officers had combed through the entire bus. Every coat pocket, every backpack, every nook and cranny where something dangerous could have been stashed had been checked, and they came up empty. Not a single thing out of place. Dillon stepped off the bus, exchanging a tense look with Williams. Their expressions said it all. This wasn't over. There was still the unsettling question hanging in the air. Who was behind the threat? Williams tilted his head toward Henry, who stood watching them anxiously from nearby. "Could it be?" Dillon muttered under his breath, not quite finishing the thought. Henry caught the look, and his stomach dropped. The suspicion in their eyes hit him like a punch to the gut. His hands felt clammy, his heart pounding as memories of his years with the school flashed through his mind. The kids' smiling faces, the harmless jokes, the trust he'd built. The idea that they could even think of him as a suspect was almost too much to bear. Swallowing hard, he stood frozen, trying to gather himself. Back at the entrance of the bus, the two officers huddled to talk it over. Williams pointed out, the intercom, it's controlled from the driver's seat. Only Henry has access to it. Dylan frowned, his mind churning. He's been with the school for years. Why now? Why do something like this? The unspoken tensions only grew heavier as the mysterious voice from the intercom played over and over in their minds. Meanwhile, word of the incident on the bus was already spreading among the parents. They gathered in small clusters, speaking in hushed voices. Henry's always been so friendly, one parent said uncertain. Yeah, but you never really know, another replied, feeding the growing unease. Whispers of doubt and suspicion rippled through the crowd, threatening to unravel the trust that once seemed so strong. Williams ran a hand down his face, clearly not thrilled but resolute. Walking over to Henry, he said, "Henry, we need to talk. Come with us. There are a few questions we got to ask." The kid sat quietly, the tension so thick you could almost feel it in the air. Henry, looking pale and struggling to keep his voice steady, stammered, "I don't get it. I never hurt these kids. Never." But this situation wasn't one that could be brushed aside. There were too many unanswered questions hanging in the air. Word of what happened spread fast, like wildfire on a dry field. Before long, a crowd of furious, panicked parents had gathered around the bus, their faces tight with concern and anger. How did this even happen? One mom yelled, her voice cutting through the hubbub. Another dad snapped, "Isn't their safety supposed to come first?" The grumbling grew louder, and with it, the trust they'd had in the school's safety measures slowly started to crumble. Officer Dylan walked up to Henry, his voice low and weighted. "Henry, we need you to come to the station with us. It's just procedure, for everyone's safety." The words hit hard, and the bus driver's shoulders sagged. As he was led away, every single pair of eyes was on him, some skeptical, some sympathetic. Outside, chaos had taken over where there was normally order. The usual calm of morning drop-offs gave way to clusters of parents talking in hushed, frantic tones. Camera crews swarmed in, snapping pictures and shouting questions. News vans pulled into the driveway, and reporters scrambled to cover the story. The school's composed, friendly atmosphere was nowhere to be found. In the interrogation room, Henry sat under the harsh glare of the overhead light, staring at a table covered with documents, file after file, tracking his spotless career. Across from him, Officer Williams spoke calmly but firmly. "Let's go through this step by step, Henry. Start from the beginning." Henry's eyes darted nervously over the papers in front of him, his own life laid out like an exhibit in a courtroom. He swore under his breath, still trying to understand how the hell it had all come to this. Taking a shaky breath, he looked up at Williams and started to speak, his throat tight with emotion. "Officer, my job has always been about those kids. I greet them every morning, make sure they get to and from school safely. That's all I've ever cared about. I love those kids like they're my own." His voice cracked as tears started to pool in his tired eyes. "I would never put them in harm's way," he said, his words filled with raw desperation, hoping that anyone, would believe him. At the precinct, the officers went over Henry's statements with a fine-tooth comb. The more they dug into his story, the more it became clear there were no cracks. "Everything lines up," Officer Riley said, flipping through the notes in frustration. The room was heavy with tension, and as the hours dragged on, frustration turned into exhaustion. They were there to protect and serve, but without any solid leads, they were stuck spinning their wheels. Meanwhile, Henry sat slumped in his cell, the dim light barely cutting through the shadows on his face. His mind was a storm, confusion, anger, and fear all fighting for space. His fingers curled around the cold steel bars as he stared out into nothing, each passing second weighing heavier on his shoulders. Just days ago, he'd been reminiscing about carefree school trips, but now those happy memories were tainted by the sting of being locked up, accused of something unthinkable. Back in the bullpen, it felt like everyone was starting to snap. Every potential lead kept fizzling out, leaving the investigators more on edge by the hour. Despite all their relentless digging, there was still nothing tying Henry to the crime. "We're chasing our own tails," Detective Mason muttered, rubbing his temples, his voice heavy with frustration. The pressure to crack the case wasn't letting up, and the dead ends weren't helping. "We should go back and check the bus again," Officer Lara said firmly, breaking the silence and refusing to let any possibilities slip through the cracks. No one argued. They were all on the same page. The officers returned to the scene, hoping a second look might reveal something they'd missed. Flashlights in hand, they started their careful sweep of the area, every corner and crevice a potential hiding spot for a clue. Inside the bus, the vibe was completely different, empty and eerily quiet. The usual buzz of conversation and laughter was gone, replaced by a heavy, almost suffocating stillness. The rows of seats seemed to stare back at them, secrets locked away. The soft hum of the bus's mechanics was the only sound, heightening the uneasy atmosphere. What used to be a familiar routine now felt like a cold reminder of the mystery hanging over them. As they stepped back onto the bus, the air felt heavy, thick with unspoken questions and possibilities. Officer Lara's footsteps made soft thuds against the floor as she moved cautiously through the aisle. Riley trailed close behind, his senses sharp and ready. They didn't expect much, but they knew they couldn't leave anything unchecked. It was their job to be thorough, even if it felt like they were chasing shadows. Then, in the oppressive quiet, Riley froze. "Wait, did you hear that?" he whispered, tilting his head. Lara stopped, listening hard. For a second, there was nothing, just the hum of the bus. But then, a faint noise, barely audible, a soft, muffled rustling sound. The two exchanged a quick, puzzled glance. "Did we miss something earlier?" Lara murmured, her voice low. Riley nodded, brow furrowed. "It's subtle, but yes, something's there. We need to track it down." The bus seemed darker, somehow, as they pressed forward, the weight of something unseen wrapping tightly around them. Each step brought the officers closer to the back of the bus, the faint noise steadily growing clearer. A repetitive tap, followed by a soft shuffle, broke the silence. Every tiny creak of the bus and scuff of their shoes heightened the tension, making every little sound feel amplified. Lara tightened her grip on her flashlight, the beam slicing through the dim interior as if it could uncover what was hiding in the shadows. The sound grew distinct now, its rhythm undeniable. Top, shuffle, top, shuffle. Hearts thudding in unison, they pushed forward, the eerie stillness pressing down on them harder with every passing second. It felt like they were on the edge, just one step away from figuring out the secret that had been eluding them all along. Squeezing down the bus's narrow aisle, the officers couldn't shake the memories of their earlier search. The space was all too familiar, but the weight of responsibility and lingering doubt made it feel different this time. Officer Lara, her face set with determination, took the lead, starting her sweep at the driver's seat and working her way down, one row at a time. The thought of their previous oversight gnawed at both of them. Did we really check everything? Could we have missed something? Officer Riley muttered, wiping the sweat that had formed on his brow. The doubt was getting to them, their confidence slipping with each step. What if they'd rushed the first time? The possibility of missing something important loomed large, the pressure to protect the kids and the community sitting heavy on their shoulders. Scattered across the seats were the remnants of a school day, an abandoned crayon, a forgotten sock, a well-loved book with bent pages. As Lara pushed her hands into the seat crevices, each little item felt like a reminder of the kids who rode this bus every day. But the answers they were looking for, the source of that strange, persistent noise, remained stubbornly out of reach. Somehow, the bus, so ordinary on the surface, felt like it was holding on to secrets. As they moved closer to the back, the noise grew louder, a steady, muffled shuffle that sent unease creeping up their spines. Lara and Riley shared a tense glance, the kind that needed no words. The late afternoon shadows stretched across the bus, turning what should have been a quiet, harmless space into something almost suffocating. Then they saw it. Under the very last seat, there was a black bag half hidden against the grimy floor. Its zippers were slightly undone, and something inside shifted, giving the impression of life, like it was trying to escape. The flashlight beams fixed on it, and Laura moved in slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. That sound, the one they'd been following, was definitely coming from the bag. Whatever was in there, they were about to find out. Both officers stared in stunned silence at the black bag. "How the hell did we miss this earlier?" Officer Laura murmured, her voice low and shaky, disbelief etched across her face. Even with the bus bathed in the red and blue glow of the patrol lights outside, the bag seemed to absorb all the light around it, sitting there like it didn't belong. Nothing about it felt right. It had an almost defiant presence, quietly daring someone to notice it. Now that they had, neither officer could look away. Then it shifted, just slightly, but enough to make the air hitch in both their lungs. Something inside was moving. "Tell me you just saw that," Officer Riley said, his voice barely above a whisper, sharp with unease. His eyes flicked nervously between the bag and Laura. It wasn't just suspicious anymore, it was terrifying. Every inch of his training was screaming at him to call for backup. "We should get the bomb squad," he said, already reaching for his radio. His instincts told him time was up. Whatever was inside that bag could very well be a ticking disaster, and protocol demanded they treat it as such. Laura stood frozen for a moment, her breath shallow, weighing their options. The seconds stretched, each one heavy with unspoken risks. Finally, she shook her head, her voice steady even as adrenaline coursed through her veins. "No, we're here. We're doing this." Riley shot her a look, doubt mingling with determination in his eyes, but he nodded. If they were opening this thing, they'd face it together. Both of them pulled on gloves, hearts pounding as they crouched by the mysterious bag. Laura took the zipper in her fingers while Riley hovered close, bracing himself. The first few teeth of the zipper seemed to scream in the deafening silence as it was dragged slowly, inch by inch. The tension in the bus was unbearable, like the air itself had grown heavier with every passing second. Both officers held their breaths. Finally, the bag was half open, its interior still cloaked in shadows, refusing to give up its secrets. Riley's hand hovered over it, his nerves steeled, preparing for the worst. Laura clenched her jaw, her mind flashing through worst-case scenarios, from suspicious packages gone wrong to the horrific outcomes she'd read about on the job. Whatever was in there, they needed to face it head-on. When Laura finally opened the bag, just wide enough to see inside, what she found stopped her cold. Too wide, frightened eyes stared back at her. Her breath caught as her focus sharpened, piecing it all together in an instant. "Riley, there's a kid in here," she blurted, her voice thick with disbelief and relief. She opened the bag wider, revealing a small, scared boy curled up and trembling, his face a mixture of fear and exhaustion. "What the how did?" Riley blinked a few times, his brain scrambling to make sense of what he was seeing. He quickly reached for his radio again, this time with a different kind of urgency. "Dispatch, we got a child." "Repeat, we've got a child. We need medical backup immediately." Laura knelt next to the boy, her demeanor shifting from tense officer to something softer, more protective. "Hey buddy, it's okay," she said gently, her voice full of warmth. "You're safe now. We're here to help, I promise." As they worked to comfort him, they couldn't stop replaying the moment in their minds. The mysterious movements, the fear, the assumptions. In the end, the Real story was nothing they could have prepared for. The danger hadn't been from the bag, but from what, or who, had been hidden inside. Now, they had a whole different kind of puzzle to piece together. When Officer Dillon stumbled onto something unexpected on the bus, he didn't waste a second. Grabbing his radio, he cut through the heavy silence with a tense urgency. "Station Bravo, this is Dillon. Code Green," he said, his voice tight. He quickly filled in the details, stressing the need to fix what was clearly a huge mistake. By the time the call was over, the weight of the whole situation was sinking in. Back at the station, the message hit hard and fast. Commanding Officer Hanson didn't hesitate. "Release Henry now," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for debate. Things moved quickly from there. Word spread. They'd gotten it wrong about Henry. Instead of pointing fingers, The focus switched to making sure the bus driver, falsely accused, got the respect he deserved. Sitting in his dim holding cell, Henry's mind was racing. He had no idea how things spiraled into this mess. Then, the sharp clang of the cell door jarring him from his thoughts. An officer appeared, looking genuinely sorry. "You're free to go, Henry," he said quietly. Relief washed over Henry like a wave. His name was cleared, but the experience had definitely left its scars. When Henry stepped outside, the sunlight hit his face, but his eyes went straight to his bus sitting nearby. It was like seeing an old pal after a rough patch. Walking up to it, he ran his hand along the side, the cool metal sparking memories of long drives, kids' laughter, and years of dedication to the job he loved. That bus wasn't just a ride, it was part of who he was. As news of Henry's innocence spread, the tide turned fast. The same people who had jumped to conclusions felt the sting of guilt. Parents who had once been skeptical now approached him with sheepish apologies. "Henry, I'm so sorry," Mrs. Anderson said, her voice trembling with regret. Others followed, echoing her sentiments, their faces full of shame. Henry, ever the kind soul, accepted their apologies with grace. He understood their fear. It was about protecting their kids. Still, it was a lesson in not rushing to judgment. The quiet bus ride was interrupted by faint giggles coming from under one of the seats. Out popped Simon, his messy hair all over the place, totally unaware of the havoc he had just caused. Scattered around him were a few little trinkets and the remote for a toy. Egged on by some older kids, Simon had thought it'd be hilarious to spook everyone with a fake threat. It never even crossed his mind how serious his prank could get. But the second he spotted the cops, Simon's playful vibe vanished. Gripping his toy remote like a lifeline, his eyes went wide, and he started to panic. I just wanted to mess around," he mumbled, tears streaming down his cheeks. The officers looked at each other, starting to piece it all together. This wasn't malice. It was a kid swept up in something way bigger than he realized. With a little nudging, Simon eventually revealed his so-called brilliant idea. Using a speaker he'd hidden under a seat near the intercom, he'd tinkered with some settings to broadcast fake scary noises through the bus. All of it was controlled by his toy remote. For Simon, it was just a little game, a harmless way to freak everyone out for laughs, not a recipe for mass panic. The officers stayed calm, but serious, their stern presence making Simon shrink into himself. "Do you understand how much fear you've caused?" one of them, Officer Dillon, asked softly. Simon nodded, his face wet with tears as it hit him how badly he'd screwed up. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he whispered, his voice shaky. It was a hard lesson, but it was sinking in fast. When his parents showed up, their expressions said it all: anger, sadness, and a deep sense of disappointment. They listened quietly as the officers went over what had happened. Pulling Simon aside, they talked to him not just as parents, but as guides trying to make him understand the weight of what he'd done. It wasn't just a grounding. It was the kind of conversation they hoped would stick with him forever. This was a turning point, a chance for Simon to grow up a little and figure out the importance of thinking before acting. The auditorium hummed with low chatter as students from every grade trickled into their seats. When Principal Martinez stepped onto the stage with her serious expression, the room fell silent. She spoke about the recent scare, laying out the consequences of poor choices. "Safety and trust come first," she said firmly. Before wrapping up, she urged everyone to stick together, think things through, and help create a safer environment for everyone. Around the same time, parents, teachers, and town officials gathered at the community center for a special meeting. Local psychologists talked about how pranks could affect people in unexpected ways. There were workshops teaching kids the line between harmless jokes and actions that could hurt someone. At candlelit vigils, folks shared real-life stories about pranks gone wrong, driving the point home in a way no one would forget. In the days that followed, the town slowly got its groove back. School hallways filled with laughter again. Parks were buzzing with activity, and cafes were busy as ever. The incident left a lasting lesson, but instead of breaking the town, it brought a stronger sense of awareness and connection. Each morning, as Henry's bus pulled up, kids raced to climb aboard, their cheerful hellos louder than ever. Parents approached him with warm smiles and hearty handshakes, thanking him for always being reliable. The doubts that had briefly hung in the air were gone, replaced by a deep trust. Henry couldn't help but feel a surge of pride and relief. He was back to being their beloved protector. As the sun came up, the town got ready for another day, and so did Henry. Driving his bus down the same streets he knew like the back of his hand, he thought about everything that had happened lately. It hadn't been easy, but those tough moments came with lessons he wouldn't trade. Feeling recharged, Henry kept at it, making sure his precious passengers were safe and sound. Every day, he played the quiet hero, getting the kids to school and back home without a hitch. Enjoyed this heartfelt little story? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more feel-good stories like this, be sure to subscribe or check out the other videos waiting for you below. Thanks for tuning in.